Our second scripture lesson this morning comes from Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 7 through 15. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking the seventh year, the year of remission, is near, and therefore view your needy neighbor with hostility and give nothing. Your neighbor might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and be ungrudging when you do so. For on this account the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you for 6 years, in the 7th year you shall set that person free. And when you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Provide for him liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. This is the word of the Lord. Everything was about to change. The Israelites who had lived for several generations in Egypt as slaves under Pharaoh had long been liberated. A new generation was raised in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. This generation learned what it meant to live each day trusting in God, depending on God for their daily manna. And now the Israelites stand on the edge of the promised land. The Israelites are about to cross over into this new place to call home and into this new way of doing life in which they'll own land, yield power, and be able to shape and live in a society with all the challenges and blessings that it brings. It's in this moment that God gives this prescription to the Israelites on how they are to live. God knows that soon they'll forget the provision of daily manna. God knows it might grow hard to rest on the 7th day each week. And so God says, in addition to the Sabbath practice, every 7th year, all debts are to be erased. For God is well aware that a temptation lies within this new life circumstance. Hearts that once depended upon God can become hardened. Hands outstretched to receive help might close now that these hands are in a position to help someone else. And so Deuteronomy offers instructions on how to live in this time and place where, as Reverend Kara Root says, sin can creep in and entices us to build ourselves up at others' expense, to guard and protect our perceived worth and ignore others' need. While that narrative is exactly what happens to many, God does not want that to happen to God's people. The Israelites are to be a people set apart, a people who see one another's humanity, who empower one another rather than holding on to power themselves, and are a people who depend on God. Just because everything is about to change, it is not time to forget. So God instructs their people to remember. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. I have to think that if this is a concern of God's for the Israelites who remember a life in enslavement, who know hardship, who know total dependence on God, then this is a concern of God's for us too. We who have never known such a life of dependence on God, we who sometimes practice Sabbath, but also have sports events and work and birthday parties on Sundays, we who only know a life of self-reliance and freedom. If the Israelites run the risk of amnesia, the possibility of forgetting their dependence on God, how much more of a risk do we run? As you may know, tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. Parts of our country observe this day in one way or another, but it's a holiday we've struggled to make meaning with in recent years. We can all agree that Christopher Columbus is a complicated historical figure. He set sail for India and discovered the Americas instead. His discovery led to colonialization and exploitation and genocide and a whole host of other horrible things to our neighbors who are here already. With this in mind, it makes sense to switch out the focus of the holiday. Why lift up and valorize an explorer who caused so much harm when we can lift up and acknowledge those who were here before so many of us? This was and is my thinking. But in 2020, living in Richmond, Virginia, as a statue of Christopher Columbus was set on fire and tossed into a lake, I grew curious. Why is there even a statue of Christopher Columbus in Richmond, Virginia? And why did we begin celebrating Columbus Day in the first place? To understand, one has to look back. In 1891, 11 Italian immigrants were lynched in New Orleans after the city's police commissioner was killed and suspicion was placed upon the Italian community. An NPR journalist writing about this writes that the 11 men had been found not guilty before the lynching. And a New York Times editorial had this reaction: "Yet while every good citizen will readily assent to the proposition that this affair is to be deplored, it would be difficult to find any one individual who would confess that privately he deplores it very much." There was just that much anti-Italian rhetoric at that time. And so a year after these lynchings, President Benjamin Harrison called for a national observance of Columbus Day. Harrison linked the 400th anniversary of Columbus's journey to the hard work of the American people. And this act was both a political move to soothe tensions with allies abroad and an attempt to shift the narrative, providing Italians with a way to claim ownership in America, weaving in the story of Columbus with modern-day immigrants and the larger story of America. Maybe now they could belong. Fast forward to the 1920s in Richmond, Virginia. Italian immigrants watched as Monument Avenue was built. They watched those with wealth and power in the city build idols to Confederate generals, lifting up this flawed idea of a hero as a way to stake claim as to who this country was for. The Italian immigrants hooked on to the same flawed idea. They worked together to get a statue of their very own hero, Christopher Columbus, onto Monument Avenue. And for both groups, the idea behind these statues was that they would give them a claim to the country, all while suppressing someone else's claim to the country. For the Italian immigrants, their effort was less than well received, Karen Sherry, a curator at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, said. This was a period of nativism, an intense anti-immigrant sentiment, And much of that was directed at Italian and Jewish immigrants or anyone who was deemed not sufficiently white or not Protestant or not of Anglo-Saxon origin. The city was not willing to put Columbus on Monument Avenue. Eventually, the statue was unveiled, but in a park that at that time was on the edge of town. The Italian Americans were emulating what they saw done by leaders in their city. Through Columbus's statue, flawed as he is, they were staking both their heritage and their right to belong to this country. They bought into the idea of power from the powers that be, forgetting that those in power did not think they or many others belonged. And in an attempt for these immigrants to stake their claim in America, they fell for the same trap that God warns the Israelites of as they stand at the edge of the promised land. Remember, how quickly do we forget our own origin stories of immigration, of family members who faced discrimination? How quickly we forget that we too need help from time to time. How quickly we forget what it feels like to be the one who needs help. The risk for amnesia is great. As God said to the Israelites, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. Throughout this passage, God's instructions go beyond telling the Israelites how to act, and instead tell the Israelites how they are to posture themselves. Do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be, reads verses 7 and 8. It's not enough to just know that it's the year in which debts are released and to begrudgingly do it. No, God instructs that you are to live always with an open hand. And this posture is not just for the Israelites to live within, it's for us. For if we clench our fists, not only are we not helping anyone, but we're not making room for what God might do with us. When we cling onto the idea of being in control so much, we can forget the very one on whom we depend. In the Florence and Machine song 100 Years, Florence Welch sings out repeatedly, "Give me arms to pray with instead of ones that hold too tightly." It's a sentiment we Christians can share in. For if we are to live as a people set apart, called by God to be the church, we are to hold a different posture than the rest of the world. Our hearts are not to be hardened, nor are our hands to be closed. We are to use our arms to pray, to reach out, to give, to comfort, to console, and to help. With our 21st century glasses on, God's instruction in Deuteronomy can feel a bit naive. God's clearly proposing a way of life that doesn't really work, right? But instead of getting caught up in the questions of those logistics, I invite you to ponder that this is actually God's intention for us, to live life in community that provides for all and gives security to all. So how do we do this? How does this work today? How do we make sure that we have hands to pray with instead of ones that hold too tightly? Well, God tells us we're to practice giving of ourselves, giving of our time, giving of our money. And there is not a one-size-fits-all way of giving, but one way we can do this is through the church, by committing to walk within a body of believers on their good days and on their bad days, by making a meal when a family has had a baby, by staying overnight with families in the Family Promise program, by shepherding in God alive, by visiting with those who are homebound, by singing in the choir, and through giving financially to the church. And along the way, in this giving of ourselves, we experience God's forgiveness and redemption in our own lives. We become aware of God's generous grace, and we cannot help but give generously in return. As I came into the church on Monday night for a meeting at the same time as the Boy Scouts and the same time as the Roanoke Valley Choral Society's practice, there was a Boy Scout on door duty. It felt fitting that the Church of the Open Door was literally open with a greeter at the door, not even on a Sunday morning, but on a weeknight, where the church was bustling with both church activities and community activities. As we walk through generosity season, celebrating not only our 100th birthday, but as we cross over into the next 100 years as Raleigh Presbyterian Church, may we continue to be a church who opens our doors, a church who uses our hands to pray with instead of holding on too tightly. May we be a church that lives into the radical generosity God intends for us to live out, trusting in God with our arms outstretched towards one another. Amen.